To be brutally honest, standard medieval interpretation of Ya'juj and Ma'juj is the following. This is what you find in Ibn Kathir, you find it in the tafsir literature of As-Samarqandi and of Al-Tha'labi, and basically this is the mainstream interpretation for our classical and middle ages of Islam. Ever since the beginning of writing tafsir, let's say 300-400 Hijrah, up until pre-modernity, up until going to CE 1800s or whatnot. If you look at any book of tafsir, any book of history, the notion was the following. Ya'juj and Ma'juj are a bizarre, exotic tribe in the nether regions of the world that have been trapped by Dhul Qarnayn thousands of years ago, and they're still trapped to this day. And quite a few medieval historians have reported that I know of a friend of mine who traveled to the end of the world and he saw with his own eyes the wall of Ya'juj and Ma'juj. We find this in respectable Islamic books. The notion that Ya'juj and Ma'juj are a living tribe, blocked to this day behind the wall that was built 4,000, 5,000 years ago. That wall miraculously is still there. People can see on the one side, and on the other side you have these savages that Allah knows how they're eating, drinking, replicating, whatnot, and they're still there for eons and eons and eons. This is the standard interpretation of our scholars of the tradition, not of the Quran and Sunnah. You understand what I'm going to get at, okay? We don't blame them. In their time frame, the world was unexplored. In their time frame, nobody traveled the world. The reason why Marco Polo became famous and Ibn Battuta became famous was because they traveled half the world. That's it. And they became world famous because they did what nobody had done. They simply went from one side of the known civilized world to the other side, and they came back. Marco Polo to Naples, to Italy, or to Sicily, wherever he was. Naples or Italy, where was he? And Ibn Battuta to Tunisia, where he was from. So people didn't travel. And folklores and legends were very common, and it was easy to believe these types of things. That there is this nether region of... And you know, if you read, by the way, even Ibn Battuta, by the way, you find bizarre fables. You find belief in mermaids, and you find weird creatures and whatnot. This is what he believed. He really believed that there are races and aliens, or not aliens, but you get my point. This is the notion of his time. Marco Polo as well, he believes these types of things. So it's not surprising that our medieval scholars believe this type of stuff. Now, obviously, dare I say, anybody who knows science and geography and modern civilization, you cannot believe that there is a tribe for 4,000 years trapped behind a wall. I mean, if you believe this, that's your position. I cannot believe it. I find this very difficult to believe. So this has led people to do multiple things. We have 20 minutes left. I have to wrap it all up now, subhanAllah. The first interpretation, which is the standard interpretation of medieval Islam, is that, okay, maybe there are places in the world that are undiscovered. Maybe there is a race of people locked up behind the Caucasus Mountains or in Mongolia or whatever, and they're still over there. And Greenland? Greenland, interesting. How would Dhul Qarnayn get to Greenland? Because he's traveling. فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. He didn't go on a ship, he walked on a road. So that kind of, it's not the Bermuda Triangle, no. But many Muslims still believe this. I have nothing to say to this. If you believe it, I have nothing to say. I don't believe it, is all I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to dismiss any person's belief, and this is the belief of medieval scholars. If you still believe that there's a big wall that is lasting for thousands of years, and by the way, no human structure is that fortified for 4,000 or 5,000 years that nothing happens to it. Even the Great Wall of China needs to be built up or whatnot. I mean, it doesn't work that way. But anyway, if you believe, and anyway, so this is, what can I say? If you believe it, you believe it. I am somebody who, what can I say? My mind doesn't believe this. Others have said, we need to reinterpret Ya'juj and Ma'juj metaphorically. And this goes back to another thing that I kept on stalling when we talked about the Dajjal, because I wanted to talk about it with Ya'juj and Ma'juj. And that is this newfangled interpretation, and it is newfangled, you do not find it in pre-modernity. This is a very modern interpretation. It only begins in the 60s and whatnot, and it has now become common, very common, so much so that many famous people, many mainstream people are explicitly or implicitly saying it in this land and in some islands in the Bermudas as well. There's a famous person who's well known for this type of theory, no names mentioned, it's not my philosophy to mention names typically, where they say Dajjal and Ya'juj and Ma'juj are symbolic. Symbolic. It's not an entity. Dajjal is, he will say, globalization. And Ya'juj and Ma'juj, they might say Russia and America, the superpowers. And honestly, I mean, okay, jokes aside, I admire the fact they're trying to salvage the tradition, because they understand that mainstream interpretation doesn't make sense. So they're trying to salvage the tradition, and they say, you know what? Dajjal is a demonic force. Dajjal is a global empire. Dajjal is the new world order. Then you get into the triangle and the eye and this and that, and the whole rabbit's hole begins. You can now, once you go down the rabbit's hole, make dua, there's nothing to be done once a person goes down that hole. What can I say? If a person believes this as well, the problem comes. The same traditions that you get the concept of Dajjal from, those same traditions tell you a lot about the Dajjal. So you can't pick and choose and reinterpret everything. Either you reject Dajjal in totality, which some progressives and modernists have done. Dajjal is not mentioned in the Quran. They reject all hadith. So they say, khalas, let's be done with. And they reject Ya'juj and Ma'juj hadith. So they say, well, the Quran just mentions 2 tribes, so they're going to come, some races will come and have a big war. Fair enough. If your principle is you're going to reject hadith, that's not ours. If your principle is no hadith, then you can derive an entire interpretation that is independent of mainstream Sunni Islam and be gone with it. But the deal of these folks is they claim to be Sunnis, and they are popular in Sunni circles, and they are trying to metaphorically reinterpret these traditions. And we say that I don't think in this case you can have your cake and eat it as well. It's nice too. I love to have my cake and eat it as well. But in this particular case, I don't think it is methodologically sound. Because the same traditions that tell you about Dajjal, tell you about Ya'juj and Ma'juj, they have all of these details we mentioned. And it's pretty vivid, the impression given, right? Dajjal will be killed by Isa, one-on-one. The blood of the spear will be shown. It's clear. Ya'juj and Ma'juj, the corpses will be piled up. I mean, those same traditions mention what we have just mentioned. So I'm not too sympathetic to this reinterpretation as well. Is that clear? I personally don't buy it. A third interpretation, and this became common. The first person I know who said this was back in the 50s. Maybe reformed, but at first I know, back in the 50s. He said that Ya'juj and Ma'juj are the Chinese race. And the great wall that was built by Dhul Qarnayn is the wall of China. And this notion spread as well back in that era, because he as well, the scholar, again I grant him credit that he realized the traditional interpretation doesn't make sense. So he said we need to rethink through this. So he attempted to rethink through, and frankly for his time and place it was a bold move, because he was criticized by mainstream Sunnism. Mainstream Sunni scholars said no, we believe in this and that, but he wanted to again salvage the tradition. Of course, what is the problem with believing that Ya'juj and Ma'juj are the Chinese folks and the Great Wall in the Quran is the Great Wall of China? What is the problem with this interpretation? Who can tell me? I like this. Chinese Muslims. No, that's not the biggest problems. We have other bigger problems than this. That's not a problem in this case. I mean, where does one begin with the problems of this interpretation? Where does one begin? There are so many problems with this interpretation. I mean, of the problems of this interpretation is that we know exactly who built the Great Wall. And he wasn't a believer in Allah. Jin Shu Shuao. He wasn't a believer in Allah, the famous emperor. He was one of the pagans of the, Shinto, whatever religion it was. And the Great Wall was actually built to protect the Chinese people from within, not from without. And the Great Wall is not a barrier that is impenetrable. People go in and out all the time. In fact, gasp, shock, I myself have gone in and out of the Great Wall. I in fact did a video that went viral 2 years ago. I took a group to China 3 years ago. And I stood on the Great Wall, and I have a video, YouTube clip. Is the Great Wall of China the wall of YAJUJ and MAJUJ? You can look at it yourself. And I said, no, it's not, don't worry. It's not the Great Wall of there. So, this as well, it doesn't make sense, neither heads nor tails, Nasar naper, literally, neither heads nor tails. It doesn't make any sense. The wall of YAJUJ and MAJUJ is not the wall of China in any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't make sense as well. Where does this leave us? Another group of, let's finish this one. I know I promised Q&A. Let me finish this up. Another group says, and this is something that I have heard myself, some ulama say, that perhaps YAJUJ and MAJUJ are not on earth but under earth. That's why the satellites haven't discovered them. And this, again, I appreciate the salvaging, I really do. But how can human beings survive? No vegetation, no plants with the sun, no oxygen, food, drink, thousands of years. And according to these traditions, we're talking about gazillions of people. What is the answer to this conundrum of YAJUJ and MAJUJ? I will disappoint you by saying there is no clear-cut answer. But wallahi, to struggle with the truth and to admit the struggle is a safer position than to invent something that is far-fetched and then pretend that it is answering the problems. I don't have a solution to YAJUJ and MAJUJ. I am personally skeptical, maybe because of my own upbringing and I have a degree in engineering. I understand mathematics and chemistry and geology, and I just find it. Now, you can quote back, Allah ala kulli shayin qadir. And I say, indeed, Allah ala kulli shayin qadir. But are we obliged to believe that YAJUJ and MAJUJ are billions of people under the earth? This is my point. If the text told us explicitly, sami'na wa ata'na. But when the texts don't tell us this, can we rethink through and say this? So I conclude with two opinions. The first of which is plausible, the second of which is even embarrassing to mention, but I will mention it. As for the plausible one, Allah knows best. Perhaps, this notion of a living tribe of YAJUJ and MAJUJ is not correct. Because if you look at all of the traditions, there is only one tradition that is in Tirmidhi with one isnad that mentions the YAJUJ and MAJUJ are daily digging. And every single day they're told to go back. All the other traditions don't mention a living YAJUJ and MAJUJ. As for the hadith in Bukhari that the wall has been opened, that could be a wall. It could be, in this case, see to what level of metaphor is allowed? Ijtihadi. If it were to be said, a wall has been opened is a metaphor that indeed YAJUJ and MAJUJ is now closer to you. Personally, I don't see this as that much of a stretch than to interpret all the hadith to mean YAJUJ and MAJUJ are symbolic in nature. But again, it's ijtihadi. The only tradition that mentions YAJUJ and MAJUJ are alive right now, and they are digging through every single day, is a solitary narration in Tirmidhi and also in other books, but the same isnad. And I did my research for this because this is problematic, and I have to say I was relieved to find classical scholars, some of them did problematize this hadith. Ibn Kathir amongst them, who said that this tradition seems to be it's an illah or a hidden defect, that it is not from the Prophet ﷺ. It might be coming from the Israeliyat. Because Abu Huraira also studied with Ka'b al-Ahbar. Ka'b al-Ahbar was the son of a rabbi, and he would narrate Isra'iliyat, and Abu Huraira would listen to him and narrate. And one of the students of Abu Huraira assumed it to be from the Prophet ﷺ. This is Ibn Kathir saying this, not me. So he said, perhaps this is from the Isra'iliyat. And this is what I firmly believe, simply because it is highly problematic to posit that there are billions of people somewhere in today's world clawing away.